That's better. Hey, people, how you doing? We're starting tonight, nearly left the mics on. I was going to say we're starting tonight a bit like Joe Rogan style, just straight in with a guest here in the studio. None of this me talking beforehand. How are you, Dr. Izzy Moore?
I'm good, thanks, Matt. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for joining us. I'm not prepared just to have my guests right next to me now. It feels like I need to sort of put you back down to the lobby for a while, but we will do this because you know what? I've been practicing with TikTok, Dr. Izzy Moore.
Oh wow, okay, you're ahead of me then.
And one of the things, but it's been quite interesting because one of the things is if you want to get someone's attention, just go straight in with it. None of this preambling and hi, I'm Matt Phillips. How would you like to know? No, it's just bam. Why do female runners get injured more than male runners? Bam. And it's like, and there's kind of a bit of a message in there. So I thought tonight we'd just start with a bam and we're both here. So
yeah, hopefully if the numbers shoot up, you know why.
Well, if you listen to the podcast, and thank you for listening to us, we are recording these live. Okay, we are doing it live because we like that bam, 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 putting our speaker on the spot. So if you do want to join us live in future, then all you have to do is look out for the adverts and it goes out on YouTube. And at the moment, it's a Monday night at 8 o'clock. And Dr. Izzy Moore is with us. It's part 3 of our 4-part gait analysis special. In episode 61, I had the pleasure of talking to Dr. Max Paquette, Associate Professor at the University of Memphis Human Performance Center. Episode 62, last couple of weeks ago, we talked to our mutual colleague, Dr. Jean-François Esculier, Vice President Director of Research and Development at the Running Clinic. Did you like that French accent attempt there?
Yeah, very good.
Was it? I'm practicing that. And then a couple of weeks' time, on Thursday, March the 2nd at 8 o'clock, this is GMT, because we're from the UK, it's produced from the UK. My guest will be Dr. Allison Gruber, Assistant Professor in the Department of Kinesiology at Indiana University, Bloomington. But in this episode, I've got the pleasure of spending some more time with Dr. Izzy Moore, Associate Professor in Human Movement and Sports Medicine at Cardiff Metropolitan University. I've had the pleasure of knowing Izzy for a while now, firstly because of a huge history of research papers which got my attention from the moment the word controversial came up. I think that was in one of the earliest papers I saw, probably a decade ago, and have ever since admired Izzy's work and obviously all the people that Izzy has worked with. So yeah, is it 10 years ago or more your first depth into running related research?
Just over 10, yeah, just over 10.
And does it feel like that? I don't want to make you sound old, but
it does. Certainly when I have PhD students, I'm like, oh, when I did my PhD, and I'm like, oh wow, okay, no, that was over 10 years ago when I started, so I need to stop making it sound like it was yesterday.
Let's bring up, actually, I have got some images here. If you listen to the podcast, you can't see what's coming up on the screen, but if you are interested in seeing it, then all you got to do is go along to the YouTube, Bunch Up Live YouTube channel, and then you can see what I'm bringing up. I have got a still here, which I'll put, even though it's on full screen, as people can still hear us. But yeah, this is just, if you're interested in any of our speakers in this Gait Analysis Series, then just go to ResearchGate, probably the easiest place, and you can find a lovely assorted list of all the papers that they've been published there. And Dr. Isabel S. Moore here, showing 76 at the moment and counting. And this was the one, let me get rid of the tab at the bottom there because it's hiding a little bit. Let's get rid of that. So this was June 2016, running economy. Oh, is there an economical running technique? A review of modifiable biomechanical factors affecting running economy. Look, running economy has been is it fair to say that's been your main passion and interest?
Yeah, certainly where I started. So that was my PhD on economical running. Really at a time, when did I start? 2010 I started. So it was really at a time when not a lot of people were looking at running economy and running biomechanics, apart from some early work in the 80s. And then came my PhD, and actually a similar sort of time, barefoot running that got published in 2010 by Dr. Daniel Lieberman, and suddenly actually a whole wave of biomechanics and running economy started happening, and I just happened to be right place, right time, I think.
Do you actually, that's interesting you should say that. Do you feel you were in the right place in the right time? Did it give you something to jump on and feel passionate about and sort of sort out the misconceptions and things?
Yeah, definitely. For me, I've always liked blending different elements of sports science and sport medicine rather than sticking to one silo. pure biomechanics or pure physiology, for example. I sat in the middle during my PhD and had a biomechanist and physiologist as supervisors, and I had to do that kind of blending together. And yeah, the barefoot running era, if shall we call it that, happened and coincided with us trying to think of where should we take my PhD after I'd done a couple of studies. And we ended up going a little bit down that route as well, which I quite enjoyed. It was probably a lot more controversial than just economical running, and being able to apply my understanding of economical running and biomechanics to barefoot running and some footwear was pretty novel. It's since become very not novel. It's being done far more. I think it's very common now. I've definitely seen the shift where actually measuring things like running economy or some performance measures alongside running gait is, I mean, there's loads of papers coming out with that, and that wasn't really as much the case when I first started.
And I'm interested, you say the barefoot kind of craze, that did stimulate a lot of people to, well, maybe that's when it became a little bit polarized. But what are some of the names or research that you kind of, I don't know whether you would regard them as kind of giants whose shoulders you stood on, but what were some of the papers that were already out there which you were looking at and maybe questioning?
I guess the Lieberman paper that got published in Nature, and I don't think we can overstate how important getting published in Nature and doing biomechanics of running. That's incredible, and that really did. Whether you agree with the barefoot running form and that side of it, it really did catapult running gait and biomechanics to a place I don't think it had ever been before. So you have to look at some of the Lieberman papers, which came from a different, they came from evolutionary perspectives. And again, biomechanics typically in kind of the sports running biomechanics, we don't have that knowledge, that background. So it was a different way of understanding human movement, which I liked the fact that they were thinking differently and they're challenging the sports biomechanics community. And then actually, your final guest, Allison Gruber, we actually did PhDs at very similar times, and her and her supervisor, I think it was Joe Hamill, they started doing also some really good, great barefoot running type studies. So there's a few over in America, less actually in the UK, tending to focus on it. There's some great stuff coming out from the Americans. But yeah, that Lieberman paper really, it was actually that paper that my supervisor handed to me and went, this barefoot running looks quite interesting. Why don't we think about that?
It's amazing. And how about Dr. Irene Davis? That was a name which I always kind of figured, I mean, to tell you the truth, I don't think I've ever said this before. I don't know how this is going to come out now, but I see you as kind of a modern Irene Davis.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, wow.
I must admit, I've never met her in person, but that was a name which I always associated. And I apologize to Dr. Davis if you listen to this now. I've no idea how old you are, but I kind of, and it's still very relevant, obviously, but I kind of associated pre-2000 with that name, which was kind of nice because I think it was a woman amongst a sea of male research. And I think you'll admit she did a fantastic load of research, but that it seems that era was also caught up in the barefoot thing and showing the kind of caught over the foot and even like later down.
Yeah, she was on that Lieberman paper, so she was the main biomechanist, and she, I think, has definitely been pushing us to think a bit differently. She, along with barefoot running, started really gait retraining. There are some early examples of changing running gait, but really her paper, I think it was in the Journal of Sports Physical Therapy, and it had just a small number of runners, handful going, oh look, we give them some biofeedback when they run, we can alter what they do, and I think this is useful for running injury rehabilitation. And again, that paper really kick-started so many papers on gait retraining, which I've kind of been on that crest a bit as well. So yeah, she's again, I think she divides opinions because she's very opinionated in her views with barefoot running and gait retraining, but she has done some really good science, and I think has really pushed forward the research and our understanding, and you can't take that away from her. And I think I have a great amount of respect and, like you say, admiration. She's been a woman in a very male-dominated world, biomechanics, for a long time now.
Definitely. Yep. Big shout out there to Dr. Irene Davis, a name which, if you're listening to this podcast and you're not familiar with, then I would say you need to look at the research a little bit deeper, then maybe go a little bit further back and see, a real legend. But now we're talking to modern legend, Dr. Izzy Moore. So you can't be a legend yet, you're not old enough. There you go. Give listeners an idea of the sort of kit you've got. I've seen photos of you at work, but at Cardiff, what sort of instruments, software and hardware have you got to do your research?
Everything and anything. We've got, I guess you could say, the traditional biomechanics of our infrared motion capture cameras and systems. So we've got loads. We've got enough to almost have 2 or 3 operating labs at the same time. We've got over 6 or 7 force plates and a big trench in our indoor running track where we can line them up and get multiple consecutive foot strikes, because one of my colleagues does a lot of sprint biomechanics and sprint starts biomechanics. So we've also had some instrumented starting blocks as well. We've custom made a treadmill that can measure force at the same time. We have very clever technicians that I'm very thankful to work with. And then we also have a lot of the new wearable technologies as well. So we've got some insoles in the shoes that can measure vertical force. We will have IMUs, so inertia sensors that measure the acceleration that you'll see a lot in papers. So we kind of have the traditional as well as some of the modern equipment, and it allows us to therefore be able to think about what are the best equipment to want for our question, but also particularly when you're working with applied sports or clinicians, that's when actually some of the wearable technologies become a little bit handier, and maybe they're the best ones to use.
Fantastic. Anyone interested in gait analysis at the moment is drooling away, I think, and cleaning their keyboard to imagine all of the gear you've got, which you can literally play around with to your heart's content. Is it just another job I'm interested in, or do you wake up thinking, right, what are we going to do today?
I love research, and I love I will talk to some of the recent collaborations I've developed, and I've gone for a phase where I haven't loved my research as much, and I'm definitely now back in the zone of really enjoying it, and just I think it's one of the best jobs in the world. I kind of just get paid to be interested in things and to go and find answers and do cool research with collaborators and really great students. So yeah, I love it, and I love just kind of going, I don't know this, so let's go and find it out.
Amazing. I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you said that you actually do enjoy it, because it sounds absolutely amazing. In talking of kind of, the other thing I wanted to mention was the last 2 guests we've had, especially Dr. Max Paquette, JF Esculier, maybe a little bit less, but they've both acknowledged, as I'm sure you will, that the significance we've placed on biomechanics, or that has been placed on biomechanics since Dr. Benedict, who was on the show not years ago. Yeah, probably was years ago. It's reduced since the 86 and 90s when he was kind of going, oh, hold on. But everyone seems to have caught up now, thinking we've been putting too much assumptions on the biomechanics, and especially linking with injury and that. But I love how you, especially in your recent studies, have started looking at factors other than sex-specific differences in biomechanics, and the work you've done. I was particularly interested in the work you've done with Grainne Donnelly and Emma Brockwell, who've both been on the show in 21 and 22. I'm just going to bring up for people who are watching the YouTube video. I think I've got a screenshot of those. So we had, let's go to the next one there. We had running during pregnancy and postpartum part Part B, I think.
Yeah, part B, part A.
How does running-related advice and guidance received during pregnancy and postpartum affect women's running habits, and also running during pregnancy and postpartum? Part A, why do women stop running during pregnancy and not return to running in the postpartum period? Yeah, tell us a little bit about why you got involved in those and what were some of the takeaways from those.
Yeah, so they really came off the back of kind of fortuitous email that I just sent. Like I said, I was at a time where I wasn't in love with all of my research. I think it was back in 2020, and reached out to Grainne and Emma off the back of their return to running clinical guidelines, and really wanted to do some more impactful research. They were really keen, so we put a survey together. It was classic lockdown research because it's a survey, and we got a phenomenal response. And that survey really had multiple aims. So those two papers were part of that survey. And we wanted to understand what actually is getting in the way of women being able to keep running when pregnant and to return to running. So if we're going to actually try and maybe do an intervention or look to support women, but we're better informed in what we're doing. So that made up part A principally, and we see a lot of essentially pelvic floor dysfunction of some of the common barriers, but also to making women stop, but also meaning they don't get back to running as well. But there are also other things like fears of maybe harm to the baby and the actual kind of input we get from others. So having been someone who is pregnant and running, you know, I know the looks that you kind of get, and sometimes that, oh, should you be running type comment, maybe it's done from a good place, but isn't necessarily that great to be saying, rather than going, how can we best support you to remain as active as possible during your pregnancy? So we're able to identify some, like I say, so those barriers that got in the way of women when they were pregnant. And then part of the part B paper was actually looking at, well, do you actually get told about exercise guidance during pregnancy and return? And only about a third of women do from their healthcare providers. And actually, it's the fact that they're not getting this kind of guidance that is also significantly affecting whether they keep going and are able to return. And we're also able to ask some really nice questions in there about those people that were aware of the clinical guidelines that Grainne and Emma put together, and that seemed to actually help facilitate women get back to running, be it on their own or indeed reach out to a pelvic health physio, which I don't actually think a lot of women are aware of or aware that's an option, because again, typically we might not get given that kind of guidance from our GP or midwives, or whoever we're seeing may not point us in the direction of a pelvic health physio. So they were really good papers to get just that. I guess to some extent it probably just reinforced what Grainne and Emma maybe knew from a clinical on the ground perspective, and we just came in with putting it out in a paper. But they were really I guess the more focused on that side of it. But there was a paper in British Journal of Sport Medicine, which was a little bit further down that list of papers there, where that was, I guess, our big hitter paper, where we tried to identify factors that contribute to women return to running. So the other papers were a bit more qualitative, as well as so we're kind of digging a bit deeper into detail, whereas our factors that contributed to return to running was very quantitative, and we're able to see with statistics basically what contributed to women to return to running. And we found that a lower fear of movement, having a high running volume pre-pregnancy, suffering from the sensation of vaginal heaviness, they influence whether someone returned to running or not pregnancy. It's a really nice, neat paper to be able to do with that clinical mind as well as that sport medicine side of things. So a real blend together.
Amazing. And we'll make sure links to all of these papers go into the show notes, which you can find on Podbean, or I also put them on YouTube about a week after we go out live. So I'll make sure links to all of that. Yeah, definitely an area with, like I say, we've talked to Grainne, Donnelly and Emma Brockwell on the show. And also even further back, we talked to Tina Maria about athletic amenorrhea. I think we talked to Sonia Fierro about her return to training after the birth of her son. And yeah, it was amazing. Even now in 2023, I think then, 2023. Yeah, just the poor information that's still out there and being given, like, don't lift anything heavier than your handbag in the first, I think it was, I don't know, it's a horrific amount of time, and only start weight bearing activity, something like 18 days in or something. It's pretty scary, and it's such a shame, because it's harming people's lives post pregnancy, isn't it? And maybe not even returning to running, or forever worrying about pushing themselves. And yes, great shame.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's kind of the state of women's healthcare, particularly in the UK in general. We kind of just think women, birth is quite natural, childbirth is quite natural, so you just naturally get back to whatever it is you wanted to do. And I think, gone through the postnatal care that we receive, I can say you don't. It's not really good. It's not good enough to support women to be back exercising at all. But in fairness, there isn't the evidence there because it's never really been researched that well. So there's a gap in the data, and there's a gap in the clinical input that women are getting.
Well, fortunately, we've got people like yourself and Grainne and Emma on it, and plenty of others who hopefully are changing. We just need you guys to be in more national newspapers and things. Now and again, something gets printed, but then something else gets printed, and you see it. It's just like, it's just forehead slaps, thinking we're going back again. We went forwards with something. Roger Kerry got something independent, or Mary O'Keefe with back pain. Or I think even Derek Griffin got something in, and I'm not sure whether Grainne. I don't know if Grainne and Emma have managed to get something. I think there was something in a national newspaper, but then it's 10 steps backwards, isn't it? Something else comes along. But anyway, let's not dwell. Although we are still going to talk about misinformation, I imagine, because we're going to move on to what probably people are wanting to listen to today with regards to gait analysis. And that typically is, for a lot of people, the kinematics, okay, the movement, because not many people have the joy of what you've got playing around with force plates, and obviously can't see kinetic changes. So a lot of people are fixated on the kinematic changes. And that's who I'm hoping the listeners to this, I hope that's what you have been fixating on, because there might be some surprises now, there might be some confirmations, but let's talk about kinematic variables, some of the sex-specific differences we do see in kinematic variables for female runners, and maybe link it with running economy, maybe first of all. Maybe give us a summary if you could.
Okay, it'll be very short because it's...
Or what is out there, and then maybe what hasn't got quite as much influence as we once thought.
Well, there's a lot of inconsistent data, as there always is with running. One of the only consistencies is greater hip adduction in female runners than in male runners, and sometimes also hip internal rotation. They're really the main consistent things that we're seeing when we're comparing males to females kinematically. Sometimes there is some data around the pelvis, but again, actually that isn't consistently shown to be different. And so I guess if you don't have all the cameras, but you do have a visual assessment, it's the hip adduction. In terms of the link then with economy, actually we don't really know a lot between that frontal plane motion and economy. We know a lot more about sagittal plane motion, and we see with the sagittal plane, the female runners actually tend to have less knee extension at toe off, so just as you're pushing off the ground, rather than trying to aim for, I guess you could say, a really straight leg, which actually kind of generates more upward propulsion. It's about having a bit more flexion in that leg, which I propose in some of our papers, is about driving forwards. So it has been shown quite consistently in female runners that this is an economical strategy that being driving forwards. And we actually see, I think there was a paper with male runners that actually found the opposite kind of correlation, that they do have more knee extension and that's better for economy. So what we do need is this kind of sex disaggregated data, because typically there's been some good studies in the last few years, quite big ones, but they've actually just pooled male and female data, and that hampers what we're able to say from a sex difference and economical perspective. So the hip abduction, there is a study which shows that actually greater range of motion in that hip abduction has been linked with a higher running, or a worse running economy, I should say, so higher metabolic costs. But that was in males. But I imagine it's probably something similar in females. But with every biomechanical variable, there's probably a sweet spot, because you can't just infinitely not have any hip abduction. So it probably sits somewhere where you'd have a nice middle ground where you have some, because we obviously, running, you need to remember, is a bouncing gait. You flex and you extend and you ab and adduct. And I think we need to move away from thinking basically stay away from the extremes, sit on the fence in the middle. And that's what we do see with some spatiotemporal data, is this kind of window in the middle of optimized gait.
So just to confirm, because I'm not sure how clear it will come out on the podcast, every time you said adduction there, it was adduction, wasn't it?
Yeah, adduction.
Yeah. Just making sure, because I know that sometimes it comes out and it might not be that clear. I don't know who invented those words, but they could have made them more similar if they wanted to. Some bloke, obviously. But yeah, so adduction. So because with this, the idea of this show is for people who are giving gait analysis. So traditionally, if a runner comes in, most of the runners we see are injured, and we'll talk about the links to injury in a second. But for runners who come in who just want to improve their performance, maybe they're not getting PBs and they like the sound of you and they come in, is it part of the jigsaw we should play around with? If we do see that they've got more adduction or internal rotation on one leg, is it worth us going, let's see if we can change that, because that might improve your economy? Or are you, as I believe maybe Dr. Max Paquette might be a little bit more, is like, no, if it's not broken, don't change it. You can't do it. It's not worth it.
Yeah, I think from a performance perspective, it's I would say very hard to justify playing around a bit unless you're really at the elite trained, fine-tuned end of the spectrum, because the changes that we have seen in literature that hasn't actually been hip adduction, but the things like stride length, contact time. Even if you do make those changes, we're talking about 2-3% changes to your economy, and you have to be very good at repeat performances for that to be noticeable because of biomechanical change. You could just wake up in a bad mood, and if particularly for less trained runners, that may be the biggest influence on what you're doing, rather than tweaking your gait. So when we change gait, there are small changes to economy. Now, that said, in untrained runners, they actually are further away from their optimal stride length. I know we'll talk about those sorts of things in a second. So suggesting that there is a bigger bang for the buck in untrained runners, but I think it's a high cognitive demand changing your gait. And I probably wouldn't start there. If you were beginning your training, I would just suggest you train better with the running you're doing, rather than trying to manipulate your running gait for essentially kind of a small, the old phrase of marginal gains, I think comes into play in that respect. And from a hip adduction perspective, I know that there's some good work by Rich Willey, and he's managed to do it from an injury perspective. So I know you can alter it. I wouldn't be able to say, that alteration would be good for performance, though. We don't really know very well with kinematics, because most people haven't played around with kinematics and looked at economy. So when I say played around, I mean manipulated it in some way, higher or lower, and measured economy. So we don't actually know the benefits or negatives of doing it.
Excellent. Cool. No, I love the way you just said, you know, with a more recreational one, there's larger things like just waking up in a good mood. I mean, that can change your pace drastically. And I think we've all experienced that. So that's a good example, isn't it, of the effect that, you know, psychological profiling can have on an athlete. But it's interesting because my take on gait analysis is that doesn't mean sell your treadmill, don't advertise gait analysis anymore. Because I still think that if a runner comes to you and they're looking for performance tweaks and they believe in you and you've got that buy-in and they respect you and you've got that therapeutic alliance, then that's a perfect time to, I think, talk their language, put them on the treadmill, have a conversation with them and everything, but then guide them towards, like you say, the lower hanging fruit. Talk about their training, their sleep, their nutrition and all this kind of stuff. Because it's like everything. If you've got to have someone, you've got to talk to them in their language and put them on a treadmill and have this conversation maybe while they're running for them to buy into it and do it. So I don't think that's a con. Some people have said, but Matt, you've got to tell them that it's not worth changing their running form. Just get them in a chair, you know, just tell them this and it. And I'm like, it doesn't work that way. They're runners. They're not normal people. They need to be, if they're not running whilst they're listening to you, then they're not going to believe you. You know, I think there's a lot of that. And I think, I'm not sure to what extent research supports that, but I think we know about, to get that therapeutic alliance, you need to get that buy-in from the runner and stuff. So we haven't got to throw all our treadmills away and stop seeing people if they want to improve their performance, have we?
I don't think so. Well, and most people, you know, I've analysed gait for people, like friends doing favors and things like this, and they always will say, oh, how can I run better, or how can I get quicker, or things like that. So you know, there are things that you can I mean, I'm not an asymmetry expert, but you know, if there are glaring differences, that's where you might go, oh, that's interesting, and have you had previous injuries, this, that, and the other. And yeah, some things that I do know just from an economy perspective that I can say, well, I know this. If you want to see how you go about changing it, and to be honest, so there are some people who can change their gait, and there's some that just can't, or they can't. They don't know what they're doing in the first place, and then if you go and try and change it, all hell kind of breaks loose, and they do some very weird and wonderful things. And actually just having that kind of bodily awareness, knowing, I guess, also from a therapeutic perspective, is important information as well.
Very interesting. Lovely. I tweeted, I'm not sure, I spent most of this morning, sad, isn't it, on the morning before St. Valentine's. I should have been out looking for presents and things, but I spent most of the morning looking at what I could, footage of Camille Herron, or Herron, I'm not sure, it's a double N. Somebody forwarded me some stuff about her and about femoral. She was born, wasn't she? I think it's congenital. She was born with kind of quite an obvious anteversion of the right hip, and you can see when she runs, it's like the knees kind of coming in it. Totally. And if she went for a gait analysis, it'd be like, whoa, cancel all my appointments. We need to change that. And yet she's probably already one of the greatest in female endurance runners we're seeing and have seen. So, and now that's great because I've got like an N=2 now, because Priska-Jepto, I was getting bored of that. For 10 years, I've been showing photos of Priska-Jepto and kind of doing all that. But now Camille Herron will be the next person. It's still only N=2, but I think when we see elites like this, who have got this variance, and whose bodies have obviously she was born like that, but the body's found an amazing way to overcome and develop this shuffle. And yeah, she admits she's not going to be a great 5K runner, but in terms of running 100 miles and more, she's beating guys. She's doing incredible things. So again, like you say, at the top, maybe tweaking it, but all the lower things you've got to have covered and everything, which obviously she does. So very interesting running gait there. Looking forward to incorporating that.
That's the thing with endurance. So with sprinting, because you're at that real limit of human performance, of speed, that's where you do see a lot more similarities in the running gait. And it's, I think, and this because I'm not a sprint biomechanist, and some of my colleagues at campus are, they have more of an understanding of this is the kind of model, if you will, of sprint running. with endurance running, because there are so many other factors and it's not at that kind of physical limit of speed. That's perhaps why we see a lot of variation going on, I think.
Definitely. They shouldn't really be compared. I think that's one of the downfalls of they shouldn't even both be called running. We should keep them totally separate, like, I know, darts and snooker. Sprinting is totally different than anything kind of 5K plus. It's totally different variables and gait changes and much more variety, like you say. But most of the things we see the other day, I mean, I spent far too much time looking. I'm not too bad. I don't kind of make little TikTok videos criticizing with videos behind me. I'm not at that stage, not yet. But yeah, most of these treadmill things we're saying, oh, look, the heel lift isn't enough and there's not enough hip extension. And you can see the person's running, doing like a 10-minute mile or something. It's like, well, why do you expect them to be having a cadence of 180 plus if they're running that slow? Because they're taking sprinting mechanics, aren't they, and trying to put it into distance running. But anyway, I did ask Camille Herron to come and watch this, and I'm not sure if you are one of the people watching it, but if you are, Camille, just first of all hail Camille, and secondly, yeah, come on the show. I'd love to talk to you about your training, and if anyone did try and change your style of running, that would have been hilarious. I'd love to see you go to a sweatshop or any foot kind of in sort of branch. It could be anything I could have mentioned then, not just sweatshop. Anyway, right, let's have a look at, I've got such a list of questions here just to keep me on track. As you can see, that's necessary. So yeah, so we've talked about a lot of the kinematic things which traditionally we associate with lack of performance. Could be, yeah, they're higher up. They're not the low hanging fruit, especially with less accomplished runners. What about if we jump to injury? Maybe what about the same kind of kinematic variables when it comes to injury? Is that different? If someone comes in pain, then are we?
Yeah, I think we were talking a little bit before. Maybe a lot of people now wouldn't go to the mechanics of someone running and link that to injury. I don't think you can ignore, particularly, you know, running gait. It's so repetitive, and injuries are typically overuse in nature in running. So ignoring the mechanics, do it at your peril. But I think what we are now more aware of is it's a piece of the jigsaw. And although we see things, again, hip abduction, adduction, that is one of the common features, particularly for females with patellofemoral pain. They have more hip adduction than females without patellofemoral pain, and also males who have patellofemoral pain. So it seems to be this characteristic of female runners with that type of injury. There are studies that have shown that you can manipulate gait and it's helpful for pain. There have been several studies. Irene, who we talked about virtually, they've been some of the most prolific researchers. But and we actually have a PhD student at the moment, so I should probably use this as if you have patellofemoral pain, please get in touch, because we're currently recruiting runners needed to look at a gait manipulation study. And we also are interested in the psychological kind of cognitive distraction element of gait retraining, and looking at how those things kind of marry up together for that individual. Because I don't think you can just look at the mechanics in this vacuum and just say, you know, that the runner we talked about just then, if you have anthropometrical issues that are from birth or from previous injuries, all of these things play a role in how you run. So you can't just put someone on a treadmill and not ask them anything. Although in a lab, that's what we typically do. So no wonder when we then publish papers, we don't have necessarily all the answers or all of the factors that are useful to understand. So I do think we should still look at running gait because of the very nature of running and the injuries that we see. But I think it's important to know it's a piece of the jigsaw and not the whole jigsaw.
Excellent. That's going to be a common theme in this series, a piece of the jigsaw and not the whole jigsaw. I'm hoping the pointer's getting through. That's the idea of having, I haven't just cherry picked these people like yourself and JF and Max Paquette. It's, you are kind of the leading researchers in this area. So if you're all saying that, then there must be something in there. Or maybe I am just picking people. I'm sure there's papers which would say the opposite. You mentioned spatiotemporal variables. Okay, so for the people who are uninitiated with that, what are you referring to with spatiotemporal?
It's just a very fancy long way of saying things like the length and time of the variables. So ground contact time or step length and cadence, whereas our kinematics are things like our joint angles, our kinetics are the forces. So I guess these are probably, especially temporal variables, are, I think, some of the most commonly reported in the literature. They're some of the most easy variables to maybe quantify, to see, and also therefore to manipulate. So there's been quite a few studies manipulating those variables as well.
Cadence seemed to be something which both Max and JF kind of favoured, and Mitch Willey as well, who sadly couldn't be on the show. But believe me, I asked him, but very busy at the moment. But yeah, he's produced some great work as well. You would have still been here, by the way. That doesn't mean you've got Rich's place.
Yeah.
Just hazard that. It would have been 5 people instead of 4.
The backup option. Thanks.
No, just I didn't know how that was going to come out. But no, I would love to have Rich here as well. Yeah, Cadence. So could you go in a little bit more detail about are there any sex specific differences maybe with regards to cadence and step length?
So some have shown that females tend to have shorter steps, higher cadence for a given velocity. But actually, there are studies show that when we normalize that to something like leg length, so the step length normalized to leg length, we see those differences get smaller and sometimes diminish, particularly at more jogging speed. As speed kind of increases, that doesn't hold true necessarily. We're suggesting that although it's not the only driver, things like our height, our leg length are factors in the step length that we produce. But like I said, it's one of the most easy manipulated variables. So when we look at it in relation to economy, we actually have quite a good understanding of how cadence, and now some of the work that I've done, ground contact time, relates to economy.
Keep going.
Okay.
I want to hear you talking.
Okay, so the relationships that we see with cadence is from an amazing study by Professor Peter Kavanagh and Keith Williams back in I think it was 1982, and they just got people to run their normal cadence and then manipulated it plus or minus, I think it was about 7 and 14% of length, and measured economy at the same time. So they literally measured 2 variables, had a really clear hypothesis what happens when we manipulate cadence to economy, and you typically see a U-shaped relationship. So the cadence they choose tends to be one of the lowest oxygen costs, and then as you manipulate it, the step length greater or shorter, oxygen cost rises, and the greater the manipulation to cadence, the greater the rise in oxygen costs. And when we then model it with some fancy maths, we can predict what's the actual optimal cadence for that runner and how close are they to doing that. And in trained runners, they actually tend to be within about 2-3% of their optimal cadence. And I mentioned earlier, untrained runners, when you do exactly the same manipulation, same measurements, they're actually up to about 8% away from their optimal cadence. And then there's been a nice, neat little study that's gone, well, if we do all of that, and then we go, can we shunt people towards their optimal cadence? It took, I think, only about 3 weeks, and they're able to produce this optimal cadence and have a lower cost of oxygen whilst they're running. And a few years ago now, I think it came out in 2019, I did a similar study, but I did it with ground contact time. So if we manipulate your contact time, again, shorter or long contact times than habitual ones you take. we see the same kind of relationship with contact time and therefore leg stiffness, which is another variable we calculated. And trained runners, again, within this kind of optimal window, that they're able to produce these contact times. So what we say is these variables are self-optimized, which means runners have fine-tuned the way they run to help minimize that metabolic cost. But these are nice variables that you can actually do in the lab and you could manipulate. So I talk about oxygen cost or running economy, but you can actually measure heart rate. So the study that did it on untrained runners also looked at heart rate, and you kind of would expect it because your oxygen consumption and heart rate tend to be have a linear relationship, particularly at those submaximal speeds. And so if you manipulate cadence and measure heart rate at the same time, you can see, again, this U-shaped relationship, and we can model it to then try and predict what your optimal cadence might be to produce the lowest heart rate.
And how long, because initially when people modify anything, well, a lot of runners, when they modify anything, then they become, because they're thinking about it, they become less economical and they feel the kind of perceived effort increases. But is the idea you do this gradually over time, and then eventually, if they're monitoring the heart rate, for example, which is accessible for most runners, then they should notice it's going down?
There aren't a huge number of studies that have done it, but they've just gone very acutely like do this cadence and try and keep doing it, and they just then remeasured after 3 weeks and found their running economy was better in that 3 weeks. But you're right, when we've manipulated running gait in the lab, and we were just looking actually at foot strike when we did that manipulation, perceived effort and oxygen costs tend to again have this kind of linear relationship at submax speeds, but actually when you manipulate gait, you almost disentangle that relationship because effort will just always go up regardless of what your oxygen consumption or heart rate is doing. And like you say, it's because you're now no longer doing something that's automated, that you don't have to think about, and you know are thinking about, and it's hard work. So it's probably very useful to have that heart rate data because it might be doing something different to your perceived effort.
Very interesting. I never know what to tell runners. Well, like at gyms, these treadmills have got heart rate monitors where you're supposed to put your hands on them and it measures your heart rate. They're flawed, aren't they?
I imagine so, yeah.
Because you're no longer running with your arms. It's not going to give you an accurate rate of. It's just in case anyone's listening and thinking, "Oh yeah, I'm going to tell my clients to go and measure their heart rate whilst they're holding on." Like, if you're a buggy pusher, fantastic. You've got a little baby and you're pushing your buggy, then maybe that might be accurate. But if you change that context, the brain's clever. Your brain knows. And if the brain senses a little bit of a change, then yeah, physiology is going to change as well. But anyway, now that's interesting because I think a lot of people listening will be aware of the changes of gait for offloading knee, for example, and things like that, and or playing around with Achilles and plantar flex and stuff like that. So, but in terms of performance, that's interesting. It's something that they could maybe give runners something to do if they are just looking for performance tweaks to play around with and measure it with heart rate.
If they, so I put together, several years ago now, some free software or a spreadsheet that they can actually just input their data in and it will model it for them and it will tell them how close they are to their optimal and what it is. So I can give you those links after, or because it's just freely available that I did.
Amazing. That'd be lovely to put in the show notes. Yeah. Excellent. Look at you producing software as well. That was so. I'll put links to your papers. It was a substantial. You said a substantial decrease in VO2 was related to improvement of the resultant ground reaction force and leg axes. Okay, right. So I'm looking at the time. Gosh, it's already 8:55. It's my fault for picking guests with so much to say and so much to ask. So we don't detract too much from female runners. Are there any variables that have been overlooked? So we've talked about the kinematics and how they're not as low-hanging fruit as you might imagine. What other variables should we be considering with female runners?
Yeah, and I think it's an important question to raise because we often, because of how we've done research, the the male running gait is often a comparison and is almost this kind of gold standard by default. We'll compare it to males. And what that means is we kind of miss is the torso breast biomechanics because we have nothing to compare them to. So when we do these studies, and there is a few different groups doing breast biomechanics. We've got some in Portsmouth in the UK and a great colleague of mine, Dr Celeste Coltman, over in Canberra University in Australia. And we're seeing more and more now that what happens up at the breast, whether you have different levels of support in your bra, can actually affect things like your stride length, the knee flexion during the contact time, the medial lateral forces that you generate. So there are implications for the overall running gait that we traditionally see or would quantify, such as the ground reaction force, the spatiotemporal metrics, the kinematics. We just don't really know as much as we should because we've always traditionally focused from the pelvis down and we're missing essentially the upper body. And so we've got really, I think we're getting to the point where we now have some data and we need to write the papers, myself and Celeste, where we actually are looking at the upper body and how it relates to the lower body in female runners, because we don't know enough about that relationship. We do know that essentially you can think of, we run, the right arm goes forward with the left leg. So we have this kind of rotational coupling, but we don't know the kind of impact maybe the breast motion might have on that coupling. And there's some nice data out there recently that shows that hip adduction might actually be related to the torso and the rotation. And they hypothesized about arm swing, but our kind of theory is around what might be going on at the breast also may influence that kind of motion. So there are some sex specific things that we need to examine that we shouldn't be then always comparing back to our kind of male default to find answers.
Fascinating. And you say some papers may be coming out soon then with regards to that?
Yeah, so we've done a couple of studies recently, and Celeste is coming over for a few months soon, so we can get our heads down and write some papers up.
Amazing. Well, that's certainly that's certainly a variable which just shows, doesn't it, all the research has been done using guys and all that sort of stuff has been missed simply because of the overdominance of male researchers. Incredible. Anything else? I don't know if you could beat that. Anything?
No.
Any other variables?
I think they're the main ones because of just how much they get overlooked and everyone focusing just on the lower limb. And you know what, I did the same during my PhD. I found my hands up to that, and so I looked for only in the lower limb. And I think we need to spend more time looking up at the other variables. So also what's going on at the arms and so on.
That's fantastic, because again, this is so, I love it where really I only do this podcast to get educated myself. If people download it, that's fine. It's purely for me. There's no altruism in it at all. But that's amazing, because that needs to become an essential part of gait analysis with a female runner, isn't it? Whether you're male or female, if you're assessing them, then what they're wearing in terms of sports bra, you need to know something about it, or you need to have the confidence to actually say, you know what, you should go and see this person here because this could be another bit of the jigsaw. And it sounds like that could be more of a low-hanging fruit than the other things they may have come to you with, like, oh, wow, it's fascinating.
And I think we as researchers, we've only started saying, when people come into the lab, they should be wearing a sports bra. You'd be surprised perhaps how few don't, and that, as we've said, can maybe influence things about their running gait. And it all comes back to, traditionally, if you've had male participants and male researchers doing it, you wouldn't have asked those questions and put those stipulations on. So we need to start rethinking every kind of common bias that we may be showing in our research, and sometimes asking just those different questions about inclusion, exclusion criteria are important as well.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, look, it's 9:01. I had so much other stuff we were going to talk about, but I think there's more than enough there, and I don't want to keep you. I know you. I mean, this is wonderful that baby has stayed asleep for an hour, isn't it? You must be
There you
inside
go.
thinking, what's going on?
It should be asleep. Should be asleep is what I'm thinking.
No, I really appreciate it, especially like you say, as you're now, looking after baby. That's amazing. And do you? How old is your little one now? Did you say a year?
Nearly a year.
And you're back to running, or are you just going to take it easy?
Yeah,
Not yet.
yeah. I did my first around 8 weeks, give or take, in the first bit of running around 8 weeks postpartum, and then ramped it up. I had very good pelvic health physios
I was going to say,
on
yeah,
speed dial, so I wasn't completely uneducated in my return. It helped to have certain friends.
Yes, definitely. I could imagine that. Well, look, that's amazing. So much. Thank you so much for your time, Izzy. If people want to follow you, you're fairly active on Twitter now, aren't you?
Yeah, I'll ramp back up once I get back into work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's at Izzy Moore. So it's IZZY Moore, MOORE PhD, at Izzy Moore PhD on Twitter. And I admire you because I think you avoid every other form of social media, don't you?
Yeah, that's the only one I do.
Yeah, respect. That's really good. Yeah, I love that. What a lovely idea. And if people want more information on the great work that you have done, well, they just need to type your name in. Like I say, it will come up everywhere. Just type in Izzy Moore, and you'll find other podcasts out there. You did us the huge honor of coming to Run Chat Live conference down in Brighton, which was lovely to meet you there in 2019. And there's plenty of articles and blogs and things out there where people have asked you to contribute. So a wealth of information. I'm hoping people who are listening to this podcast, if you don't know Dr. Izzy Moore and the work that she's done, when this is going to be fantastic for you. It's going to open up a wonderful box of information. So before we sign off, just to let you know that on Thursday, March the 2nd at 8 p.m. GMT, my guest will be Dr. Allison Gruber, Assistant Professor in the Department of Kinesiology at Indiana University in Bloomington. And again, we'll be focusing on, this will be the final part of gait analysis. As Izzy was saying, Allison Gruber is another huge name in the world of running related research. So if you do want to join us live and ask some questions, then that's what you need to do. Just go along to Run Chat Live YouTube channel on Thursday, March the 2nd, 8 o'clock. But if you prefer in the comfort of your own home, which I understand, listening to the podcast, the cup of tea, and then pausing it and doing your own thing, that's great as well. But if you've enjoyed the episode, then please just leave a rating and review, just so the good word of our guest, for example, Dr. Izzy Moore, gets out there more, because that's what it's all about. Some amazing information, but we just need to reach more people to help educate the coaches and the therapists and look after the runners and make a little bit of a difference. Especially, it would sound, with female runners who, as we've seen in this episode, kind of are still playing second fiddle when it comes to correct advice and information and how they're looked after by our healthcare system. So there we go. Thank you once again, Izzy, Dr. Izzy Moore.
Thank you, Matt. Always a pleasure to talk running with you.
No, it's great. The pleasure is mine, honestly. And hopefully we'll see some of you, like I say, on Thursday, March the 2nd at 8 o'clock. Take care.